Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming tonight. So I'm going to address the question, is there such a thing as Jewish literature? And at first, it might sound like simply a rhetorical question, because the answer is surely obvious. Go into any bookstore or library, and the Judaica section will be overflowing with books, and that's not to mention Jewish authors in the fiction and poetry and history sections. No wonder Jews take pride in thinking of themselves as the people of the book. This designation originates in Islam. The Quran refers to Jews and Christians who have their own pre-Quranic revelations as peoples of the book, and appoints them a higher place in society than ignorant pagans. But modern Jews have taken it over as a peculiarly fitting designation, even a title of honor, as though Jewish culture has a special affinity for books, as though reading and writing are in some sense constitutive of Jewish identity. That's the argument made by the Israeli novelist Amos Oz and his daughter, the historian Fania Oz Salzberger, in their recent book, which is called Jews and Words. Judaism, they insist, is more than a creed, a set of principles in which all Jews must believe, and it's more than a genetic relationship or an ethnic identity. What defines Jewishness, the Oz's believe, is a special relationship to texts. Jewish children, they write, were made to inherit not only a faith, not only a collective fate, not only the irreversible mark of circumcision, but also the formative stamp of a library. Jewish continuity has always hinged on uttered and written words, on an expanding maze of interpretations, debates, and disagreements. Ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. Of course, there's some self-flattery in this idea. Every culture has its books, and some have literary traditions as old or even older than Judaism. This point was driven home to me by a recent exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of contemporary Chinese art, whose title significantly was Ink Art, art made with and about the implements of writing. One of the most striking works in this exhibit was called Family Tree, a series of photographs by the artist Zhang Huan, in which he documents the way he inscribed classic Chinese texts in ink on his own face. With each image, the characters grow thicker and harder to read, and the artist's face more deeply dyed, until his face is entirely a blue mask. It's a brilliant image of the burden of literary tradition. The inheritor of so many texts is eventually submerged by them, but also of the creative and transformative power of tradition. The blue of the artist's face is an exotic and ambiguous kind of beauty, just as the soul, formed by 3,000 years of literary tradition, takes on a special distinction, one in which deformity and sublimity seem linked. Now, this was not a Jewish image, which reminds us that Jews are not the only ones to grapple with the long literary tradition, but it seemed to me that it easily could have been a Jewish image. Indeed, it put me in mind of a famous aphorism from Pirkei Avot, the collection of rabbinic sayings, whose title is usually translated as Ethics of the Fathers. Rabbi Yaakov would say, "One who walks along a road and studies and interrupts his studying to say, 'How beautiful is this tree? How beautiful is this plowed field?' The Torah considers it as if he had forfeited his life." This is likely to strike a modern reader as harsh and puritanical. How could it be offensive to God to notice the beauty of God's creation? The text doesn't exactly say that we should never notice worldly beauty. Indeed, Jewish tradition prescribes a prayer to say when seeing a natural wonder, "We praise you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who makes the works of creation." But Rabbi Yaakov does make clear that when the world competes with Torah study for our attention, the Torah must win every time. In a sense, the sacred text is a more intimate and important reflection of God than even the world that God created. Textuality is the Jews' most authentic way of encountering the world. In her short story, The Pagan Rabbi, Cynthia Ozick offers a provocative fable on this theme. The rabbi of the title, Isaac Kornfeld, begins innocently enough by starting to notice the beauty of brooks and flowers. But soon he advances to worshiping nature, and finally he falls in love with a dryad, a pagan tree spirit, and even has sex with her. Scripture, he notes, does not forbid sodomy with the plants. He's devastated, however, when he's granted a glimpse of his own soul as the dryad perceives it. He takes the form of a quite ugly old man, trudging down the road holding a huge and terrifying volume, a tractate of the Talmud. His cheeks are folded like ancient flags, Ozick writes. He reads the law and breathes the dust. A Jew is spiritually a scholar, wedded to old books, even when he thinks he's achieving communion with nature. Like the dyed face of Zhang Huan, the Jewish spirit is made of ink, not flesh and blood. When Kornfeld, his love thwarted, commits suicide by hanging himself from a tree, his widow sees it as a just punishment for his sin, which was to elevate the body above the mind, nature above text. We are not like them, she says, meaning Gentiles. Their bodies are more to them than ours are to us. Our books are holy. To them, their bodies are holy. For Ozick, being authentically Jewish means choosing text over everything, even over life itself. This is a shocking proposition, and she intends it to be, for she's confronting the modern Jewish reader with a conception of Jewishness that the modern world has rendered antiquated, if not offensive. Indeed, the harshness of traditional Jewish education, the way early training in texts rendered the Jewish student alienated from nature and his own body, was one of the main complaints of the Jewish Enlightenment, known as the Haskalah. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the pioneering modern Hebrew poet, echoed this criticism in his long poem Hamat Mid, the Talmud student, where he describes his fellow young scholars. When young, I heard these voices, I saw these mute toilers, brows furrowed, wide eyes, pale-faced, as if begging mercy. Each furrow and glance a strangled urge, a dead spark. They stirred my thoughts. Scalded, my heart recoiled. But remembering their cry at night like men being slaughtered, I cried out, God, what are they dying for? Despite such ardent protests, however, Ozick insists, not so much pessimistically as fatalistically, that the Jewish connection with texts is too deep to be erased by any political or cultural program of modernization. She's making the same point about Jews and words that the Oz's make, but in a more polemical and confrontational spirit. And perhaps they are right that the Jewish connection with literature is qualitatively different from those of other cultures, even the most literate and literary. The reason is that for the majority of Jewish history, books were not just one element in Jewish culture. They were the primary element, maybe even the only one. China's history, to go back to that example, is one of wars and empires, military heroes, visual art, political reforms, great buildings and beautiful artworks, all the usual things we think about when we study the history of a great culture. Now, the Jews, too, once had their share of this kind of worldly achievement. The Bible is our record of Israel's generals and kings and of monuments like the Jerusalem Temple. But in the year 70, the temple was destroyed by a Roman army under the future emperor Titus, and the state of Judea was abolished. For the next 1900 years, until the founding of the state of Israel in 1948, the history of Judaism would not be told in political terms. It would be instead a history of books. The major events in Jewish history in the diaspora are the books that influenced the way Jews thought, lived, and imagined. This must always be kept in mind, for books were the active expression of the Jewish people, the way they expressed their agency and independence. Leave them out of the picture, and the Jews come to seem like mere objects of history instead of history's subjects, the perpetual victims of persecution and expulsion. To know what Jews suffered, we have to learn about the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Holocaust. But to know what Jews did, we have to learn about the Babylonian Talmud and the Guide of the Perplexed and the Zohar. For Amos Oz and Fania O. Salzberger, Jewishness is constituted by a particular relationship to texts. This is a hopeful argument, for it suggests that the form of Jewish culture remains, even when its content has fragmented. Today, Jews may be divided between Israel and America, between Hebrew and English, between orthodoxy and secularism, to name just the most prominent lines of fracture. But we are still united, the Oz's believe, by textuality, the sense that reading and writing are the most authentic way of relating to the world, and the premium that Jewish families have always placed on literacy and intellectual achievement. Jewish parenting, they write, had, perhaps still has, a unique academic edge. Being a parent meant performing some level of text-based teaching. The classic example of that ideal can be found in the Passover Seder, when we read about the four sons, the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask a question. The wise son, the good son, is defined by his intellectual curiosity. What does the wise son say? What are the testimonials, statutes, and laws that the Lord our God commanded you? And his reward is to be initiated into the knowledge of Jewish law. The answer is, you should tell him about the laws of Pesach, that no one may eat dessert after eating the Pesach offering. This is Jewish education as it is supposed to be, asking questions and receiving answers, passing along knowledge from generation to generation. The question, however, is whether education remains Jewish when it has stopped asking about the testimonials, statutes, and laws that make up Judaism. Is there an identifiably Jewish style of thought which marks its practitioner as belonging to Jewish tradition, even when he is not consciously engaged with that tradition? This question became a central one for Jewish culture starting in the 18th century, when the process of Jewish emancipation began. For the first time, in parts of Central and Western Europe, it became possible for Jews to contribute their intellectual powers not to the traditional Jewish pursuit of legal study, but to secular subjects like philosophy, medicine, science, and literature. Just how exhilarating this change was for Jewish intellectuals can be seen in the remarkable autobiography of Solomon Maimon, who lived in the second half of the 18th century. Maimon, who took that name in honor of Maimonides, the philosopher who most inspired him, was born in what he describes as a miserably backwards Jewish village in Lithuania. He was a precocious child who displayed an early curiosity about all kinds of subjects from painting to astronomy. Yet he remarks bitterly that all of these pursuits were forbidden by the traditional Jewish culture in which he grew up. In that culture, Maimon explains, the only legitimate subject of study was the Talmud, and the only possible aspiration for a gifted boy was to become a rabbi. A gifted girl, of course, was not allowed even that much. Maimon dramatizes his predicament with a story. This is his story from his childhood. I had a great inclination and talent for drawing. True, I had in my father's house never a chance of seeing a work of art, but I found on the title page of some Hebrew books woodcuts of foliage, birds, and so forth. I felt a great pleasure in these woodcuts and made an effort to imitate them with a bit of chalk or charcoal. What, however, strengthened this inclination in me still more was a Hebrew book of fables, in which the personages who play their part in the fables, the animals, were represented in such woodcuts. I copied all the figures with the greatest exactness. My father indeed admired my skill in this, but rebuked me at the same time in these words, "You want to become a painter? You are to study the Talmud and become a rabbi. He who understands the Talmud understands everything." The story Maimon tells in his autobiography is of his gradual revolt against this kind of intellectual tyranny and his escape from Jewish orthodoxy and superstition into the fresh air of the European Enlightenment. This involved a difficult process of self-education, including teaching himself to read German, which he did, amazingly, by figuring out that the position of the letters in the German alphabet was similar to that in the Hebrew alphabet, so that B made the same sound as bet and D as dalet and so on. That's how he taught himself to read. His introduction to secular philosophy, he writes, came when he entered a shop where the pages of a book on metaphysics were being used to wrap sticks of butter, and he managed to convince the shop owner to sell him the book instead. Finally, after exploring Jewish spiritual movements like Kabbalism and Hasidism and finding them all wanting, Maimon resolved to leave Lithuania and head for Berlin, the capital of the German Enlightenment, and a place where Jews, like Moses Mendelssohn, were managing to find a place in secular philosophy. It took him several tries to establish himself in Berlin, and he spent years wandering from city to city, living on charity or else starving. In time, he did achieve the reputation he hoped for as a philosopher. His crowning moment came when Immanuel Kant himself announced that no one had understood his work better than Maimon. Still, cut off from traditional Jewish society and unable to find a place for himself in Gentile society, Maimon lived an unhappy and unsettled life, and he died young. In a book of reminiscences compiled after his death, his friends noted that when studying a difficult mathematical or philosophical work, he would instinctively fall into the traditional rocking and chanting he learned while studying Talmud as a boy. It's a poignant image of the Jewish intellectual translated into a non-Jewish context, yet never really losing the signature of his origins. Is a Jewish intellectual still doing something Jewish when he studies Kant instead of the Talmud? Solomon Maimon would not have thought so. For him, the whole point of the Enlightenment was that it meant leaving parochial identities behind and joining in the universally human. For him, Jewishness was not a resource to be employed, but a trap to be escaped. And certainly there are areas of intellectual activity in which the mind operates independently of its biography. Science, above all, which is the pursuit of objective truth about reality. When the Nazis called Einstein's theory of relativity Jewish science, they were denying that basic objectivity, as if the reality observed by Aryans and the one observed by Jews were irreducibly different, or worse, as if there was something in the Jewish mind that made scientific inquiry impossible. So there is something deeply problematic about the idea that it's possible to be Jewish in form, in style, in habit and manner of thought, without being actually Jewish in content and subject matter. If a mind is trained to study Talmud, we have no problem calling it a Jewish mind. But if a mind is trained to study physics and it happens to belong to a Jew, is it still a Jewish mind? Or to take another example, what about if the mind is that of a composer? Look back for a moment at Moses Mendelssohn, who I mentioned earlier as an example of a Jew flourishing in Enlightenment Germany. He struggled all his life to balance his Jewish identity with his philosophical commitments. In his landmark book, Jerusalem, he insisted that it was possible to be both a modern thinker and an Orthodox Jew. This was his advice to his fellow Jews. He wrote, "Adapt yourselves to the morals and the constitution of the land in which you have been removed, but hold fast to the religion of your fathers too. Bear both burdens as well as you can. Remain unflinchingly at the post which Providence has assigned to you, and endure everything that happens to you, as your lawgiver foretold long ago." But this double burden, being German and being Jewish, turned out to be heavier than Mendelssohn's own children were willing to bear. Many of them converted to Christianity, and all of his grandchildren grew up as Protestants. One of those grandchildren was Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the great composer, who became famous in part for his production of Christian sacred music, oratorios on biblical subjects, and choral settings of psalms. Mendelssohn identified himself as a Christian artist. Surely, however, the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn must, in some sense, by inheritance, by family background, by culture, also be a Jewish artist. And yet, in the 19th century, the idea that Mendelssohn was a Jewish composer was not a compliment or an interesting subject for inquiry. It was, rather, the charge leveled against him by musical anti-Semites, who refused to believe that a Jew could ever truly enter into the spirit of German music. That's the argument made by Richard Wagner in his notorious essay, Judaism in Music, where he writes, "Mendelssohn has shown us that a Jew may have the amplest store of specific talents, may own the finest and most varied culture, the highest and the tenderest sense of honor. Yet without all these preeminences helping him, were it but one single time to call forth in us that deep, heart-searching effect which we await from art because we know her capable of it, because we have felt it many a time, as soon as once a hero of our art has, so to say, but opened his mouth to speak to us." A Jew, Wagner is certain, can never be a hero of art, because he can never escape Jewishness. The Jew, he writes, speaks the language of the nation in whose midst he dwells from generation to generation, but he speaks it always as an alien. In other words, Wagner is championing the idea that a Jewish mind is always identifiable as Jewish by its products, that there is some essence of Jewishness that makes Mendelssohn a Jewish artist despite his Christianity. And this Jewishness, of course, is not just different, but inferior. As Wagner writes, "What issues from the Jew's attempts at making art must necessarily, therefore, bear the attributes of coldness and indifference, even triviality and absurdity. And in the history of modern music, we can class the Judaic period as that of final unproductivity, of stability gone to ruin." This idea was not confined to Wagner's essays, but even made its way into his operas. In The Master Singers of Nuremberg, there's a portrait of a bad composer named Beckmesser, whose harsh, incompetent, tone-deaf songs demonstrate all the musical disabilities that Wagner associates with Jews. So clearly, it's problematic to speak of Jewish music. The expression has an ugly history, and it involves all kinds of quandaries about Jewish difference. It's against this background, however, that I'd like to circle back to the question I began with. Is there such a thing as Jewish literature? In other words, is there some quality or essence that unites different forms of literary expression by Jews across barriers of time and language and culture? To put it more concretely, do a story in German by Kafka, an essay in English by Susan Sontag, and a novel in Hebrew by Amos Oz all belong in the same category? And what about if we add to that category the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, and the commentaries of Rashi? Is there any meaningful way in which these are all Jewish works, other than the trivial fact that they were all written by Jews? Now, one possible answer to that question, as we've seen, is that there is something distinctive about the way Jews relate to texts. If textual study is the core of Judaism, and historically that's exactly what Jewish education meant, study of texts, then perhaps a deep involvement with texts itself is enough to make those who practice it part of Jewish tradition. This idea has been popular among modern American Jewish intellectuals, who have often taken intellectuality itself to be a form of Jewish practice. Harold Rosenberg, the art critic who was a charter member of the influential group known as the New York Intellectuals, proudly remarked that for 2,000 years, the main energy of Jewish communities has gone into the mass production of intellectuals. His implication is that a Jew who spent his life analyzing Talmudic debates and a Jew who spends his life analyzing the poems of T.S. Eliot or the novels of Henry James are essentially doing the same thing. Both are engaged in the Jewish activity of interpretation, the discovery of meanings in texts. That's a reassuring idea for an assimilated American Jew, since it seems to make it possible to be authentically Jewish without knowing anything in particular about Judaism. But Lionel Trilling, the literary critic who, like Rosenberg, was an archetypal New York intellectual, did not believe that merely being a critic, an interpreter of texts, was enough to qualify him as a Jewish writer. He wrote, "It is clear to me that my existence as a Jew is one of the shaping conditions of my temperament, and therefore I suppose it must have its effect on my intellect. Yet I cannot discover anything in my professional intellectual life which I can specifically trace back to my Jewish birth and rearing. I do not think of myself as a Jewish writer," in quotes. "I do not have it in mind to serve by my writing any Jewish purpose. I should resent it if a critic of my work were to discover in it either faults or virtues, which he called Jewish." Was Trilling correct? Or was he, simply by virtue of being a literary critic, a more Jewish writer than he knew? Obviously, the very activity of literary criticism can't be considered distinctively Jewish. If it were, then you would have to claim that everyone from Dr. Johnson to Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot were, in some sense, Jewish writers. But perhaps there are particular kinds of interpretation that have roots in Jewish tradition. Perhaps Jewishness is not so much a way of writing as it is a way of reading. The only way to answer that question, however, is to look at canonical Jewish commentaries and interpreters to see what kind of role interpretation has traditionally played in Judaism. This is, of course, an enormous subject, one that I'm not qualified to talk about in any kind of depth. But I would like to examine just a couple of examples of traditional Jewish interpretation to see what they look like and what, if anything, can be deduced from them. Take, for example, the way the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud interpret the Purim story from the book of Esther in Tractate Megillah, which is the part of the Talmud devoted to laws of Purim. In chapter 6 of the book of Esther, we read about how King Ahasuerus, unable to sleep one night, orders his servant to read to him from the royal book of Chronicles. He happens to listen to a passage about how Mordecai, the uncle of Queen Esther, once foiled a plot against the king's life. Realizing that Mordecai has never been rewarded for this service, the king asks Haman for advice. Haman, of course, is the enemy of Mordecai and the enemy of the Persian Jews. Now here's the text from the Bible. "So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the crown which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Then Haman took the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor. Now that incident marks the turning point in the book of Esther. Haman, who has been plotting to murder Mordecai and with him all the Jews of the Persian Empire, finds himself forced to honor Mordecai instead. Soon, thanks to Esther's intervention, his plans against the Jews will also be thwarted. Now, when the rabbis of the Talmud came to recount this moment in the story, they took such delight in Haman's humiliation that they added new details not found in the biblical text in order to heighten and prolong it. Before Mordecai can mount the king's horse, he informs Haman in the Talmudic version of the story, he must visit the bathhouse and trim his hair. For, he says, it is not proper conduct to use the king's garments in this state before he's been dressed up and barbered. In the meantime, however, Esther has sent messengers to all the bathhouses in the city ordering them to close. So Haman has no choice but to do the job himself. He took Mordecai into the bathhouse and washed him, and he went and brought scissors from his house and trimmed his hair. While he was trimming his hair, he injured himself and sighed. Mordecai said to him, why do you sigh? Haman said to him, the man whom the king had once regarded above all his other ministers is now made a bathhouse attendant and a barber. Now those are details that are only in the Talmud. You won't find them in the book of Esther if you read this story. The places have been reversed. Instead of Mordecai being ordered to bow before Haman, now Haman has to perform the menial task of cutting Mordecai's hair. But Mordecai gets in one further jab. Wicked man, he tells Haman, were you not once the barber of the village of Kartsum? For it was taught, Haman was the barber of the village of Kartsum for 22 years. Now there's nothing about Haman being a barber in the book of Esther. This is a gratuitous insult to his social status, designed to further his humiliation. It reads very much as if the rabbis of the Talmud were rubbing it in, inventing new ordeals for Haman in order to glory in the defeat of the Jews' worst enemy. But it's significant that the Talmud itself does not believe that it is adding something to the story or interfering with the text. On the contrary, the detail about Haman being a barber is something that is taught. To be valid, any addition to the text must not be an invention, but a fact handed down from time immemorial, which is what they believed they were. This happens even more dramatically when the rabbis reach the line, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Listen to what happens next in the Talmud, though not again in the book of Esther itself. As Haman was taking Mordecai along the street of Haman's house, Haman's daughter was standing on the roof and saw the spectacle. She thought to herself that the one who is riding on the horse must be her father, and the one walking before him must be Mordecai, when in fact we know it's the reverse. She then took a chamber pot and cast its contents onto the head of her father, whom she mistakenly took as Mordecai. When Haman raised his eyes, she saw that he was her father. In her distress, she fell from the roof to the ground and died. Now, this is a wonderfully gross example of literary revenge. The humiliation of Haman is already implicit in the whole situation, but the rabbis make it explicit by having him covered in excrement and then killing off his daughter to boot. But how do the rabbis justify this addition to the biblical story? The answer is given by Rav Sheshet, one of the rabbis of the Talmud, who points to a verse from the original book of Esther. The verse reads, Haman hastened to his house, mourning and having his head covered. Now, in the original context, it's plain that this mourning and disguise are simply because he's embarrassed at having been seen in public leading Mordecai's horse. But Rav Sheshet seizes on the biblical phrasing and seeks to expand on it. If Haman is in mourning, surely it's because he's mourning for someone who died. And if he has his head covered, surely it's because there's something objectionable on his head. This is not to say the story of the chamber pot and the dead daughter fits the details of the text perfectly. This is not to say that the story was just invented to meet the requirements of the verse. Perhaps the story was made up first, and then the verse was brought in later to give it legitimacy. but Rav Sheshet's remark does give us a vivid and fascinating example of one kind of rabbinic interpretation, or midrash. A biblical story is not necessarily complete. By attending to the exact words and expressions it uses, we can extrapolate other details that fit the spirit and the intention of the story. This kind of midrash is seen not as violating the integrity of the biblical text, but completing it. At the same time, midrash can also end up contradicting or even voiding the biblical text if for some reason the rabbis find the Bible's account objectionable on moral or theological grounds. Take, for instance, the very brief account in Genesis chapter 35 about Reuben, the oldest of Jacob's 12 sons. And it came to pass, while Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went and he lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard. That's the whole story, a single verse. It's not mentioned again until the end of the book of Genesis, when the dying Jacob curses Reuben, saying, "Unstable as water, you shall not excel because you went up to your father's bed and defiled it. He went up to my couch." Now, there would seem to be no ambiguity in that brief story. Reuben had sex with Bilhah, which is practically incest, since she was his father's concubine, his father's bedmate. But when Rashi, the great medieval commentator, came to annotate this verse in his commentaries on the Torah, he explained that, in fact, Reuben did no such thing. Actually, what he did was simply to literally move his father's bed, taking it out of Bilhah's tent to put it into the tent of his own mother, Leah, who was Jacob's first wife. As Rashi writes, as a result of the fact that Reuben disturbed the location of Jacob's bed, Scripture treats him as if he had lain with her. And why did Reuben disturb and desecrate Jacob's couch? Because when Rachel died, and remember, Jacob was married to Leah and Rachel, they were two sisters, and Rachel was the one that he loved more. Rachel was the one that he favored. When Rachel died, Jacob took his bed, which had regularly been situated in the tent of Rachel, and not in other tents, and put it into the tent of Bilhah. Reuben came and demanded satisfaction for the insult to his mother, Leah. He said, "If my mother's sister was a rival of my mother, how should my mother's sister's handmaiden be a rival of my mother?" That is why he disturbed the location of Jacob's bed. In this way, Rashi, and he's drawing on a long exegetical tradition that goes back to the Talmud, evacuates the literal meaning of the biblical text. Reuben, the patriarch's son, namesake of one of the 12 tribes, must have been too righteous a man to do something as sinful as sleep with his father's concubine. It follows that that cannot be what the Bible meant. It must have meant something else, and the story Rashi offers reflects much better on Reuben. Now he is motivated not by transgressive lust, but by a noble desire to protect his mother's rights. This kind of midrash is very free with the literal meaning of the biblical text, but only in the service of what it sees as a higher kind of truth. It tells us what the Bible should have meant, what it ought to have meant, if it is to be the kind of book that piety expects it to be. The idea that the biblical authors were less pious than the rabbinic readers, that the Bible countenances a lot of behavior that would have appeared sinful to those later readers, is a modern insight that the rabbis don't share. To look at these classic examples of Jewish exegesis is to recognize that, despite Harold Rosenberg's implication, there's no real similarity between the way the rabbis interpreted a text and what a contemporary secular literary critic does when he or she interprets a text. When the rabbis interpret a sacred text, they do so in a paradoxical way. They are at the same time far more reverential towards it than we are toward any literary text, and at the same time far more free and creative in their reading. That's because a biblical story is, in the traditional view, written by God, and a text of divine origin must be as infinite as its author. It's impossible to read anything into such a text because it already contains every conceivable meaning. With a literary text, on the other hand, the critic's interpretation must stay within the boundaries defined by genre, language, and authorial intention. A reader of Henry James, who invented new details in the life of Isabel Archer in The Portrait of a Lady, the way Rav Sheshet invented new details in the Esther story, would be considered a very irresponsible critic. So is it possible, then, for a modern, secular Jewish writer to appropriate this tradition, to make use of it in an authentic way? One answer is provided by the work of Walter Benjamin, the highly influential German Jewish critic, whose essays on literature and mass media are some of the foundational texts of modernism. Benjamin's relationship to his own Jewish heritage was problematic. Raised in a secular home, he knew almost nothing about Judaism as a religion and identified himself strongly with the German literary tradition. Yet his friendship with Gershom Scholem, who would go on to become the leading modern scholar of Jewish mysticism, introduced Benjamin to some of the key concepts of Jewish tradition, including the idea of God as an author who used language, the Hebrew language, to create the Torah and the world. In his famous essay, The Task of the Translator, Benjamin draws on this idea to develop a radical theory of language and translation. As he writes, the question of whether a work is translatable has a dual meaning. Either, will an adequate translator ever be found among the totality of its readers? Or, more pertinently, does its nature lend itself to translation, and therefore call for it? In principle, only the first question can only be decided contingently. That is, a text might be translatable or not, depending on if the right translator comes along. The second, however, can be determined apodictically, in advance, a priori, whether or not it is ever really successfully translated. It could still be translatable in some way. Benjamin writes, only superficial thinking will deny the meaning of this question and declare both to be of equal significance. It should be pointed out, in refutation of such thinking, that certain concepts retain their meaning and possibly their foremost significance if they are not from the outset used exclusively with reference to man. One might, for example, speak of an unforgettable life or moment, even if all men had forgotten it. If the nature of such a life or moment required that it be unforgotten, that predicate would imply not a falsehood, but merely a claim unfulfilled by men, and probably also a reference to a realm in which it is fulfilled, God's remembrance. Analogously, the translatability of linguistic creations ought to be considered even if men should prove unable to translate them. Given a strict concept of translation, would they not really be translatable to some degree? The question as to whether the translation of certain linguistic creations is called for ought to be posed in this sense. Benjamin's language here is characteristically difficult, even opaque, but his basic point can be discerned. A text might never be successfully interpreted by human beings, but in principle, it remains interpretable because there is a perspective, God's perspective, from which the fullness of its meaning can be seen. This is a frankly mystical conception of language, and it has a deep affiliation with the way the rabbis read Scripture. For the rabbis, too, the interpretability of texts was guaranteed by their divinity. Benjamin's radicalism lies in the way he extends this interpretability even to human texts, to works of secular literature. All language, he says, not just sacred language, has a divine and infinite dimension, so that translation becomes a kind of priestly task. The difference is that while the rabbis had confidence that their own interpretations were authorized by God, that what they said about Haman and Reuben was true, a secular interpreter can have no such certainty. What Benjamin is dramatizing here, then, is the rupture of a tradition. Benjamin places himself in the lineage of Jewish textual interpreters, not simply because he's a Jew who happens to be a literary critic, like perhaps Lionel Trilling, but because he takes seriously the metaphysical principles that governed Jewish exegesis. Yet he speaks as one who has inherited the form of that tradition without its content. He knows that the importance of interpretation is infinite, but he's no longer sure that he is actually capable of finding the correct interpretation. Elsewhere in Benjamin's work, this principle is extended from actual literary texts to all of creation. In a mystical early essay called On Language as Such and the Language of Man, he writes, to sum up, all communication of the contents of the mind is language. Communication in words being only a particular case of human language and of the justice, poetry, or whatever is underlying it or founded on it. The existence of language, however, is coextensive not only with all the areas of human mental expression, but with absolutely everything. There is no event or thing in either animate or inanimate nature that does not in some way partake of language. A Kabbalist might say the same thing, but the traditional Jewish mystic believed that it was possible to read the words of nature because they were the words, literally the Hebrew letters, with which God created the universe. For Benjamin, that communication is broken. We live in a world constituted by a language that we don't know how to read. That has a very Kafkaesque sound, and it's no coincidence that Benjamin became one of Franz Kafka's early critical champions. Both emerged from the German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie in the early 20th century, a time of deep crisis in the Jewish world, with assimilation failing, persecution on the rise, and the Holocaust just over the horizon. So it makes sense that Kafka, like Benjamin, was especially attuned to the idea of fractured tradition and blocked interpretation. That idea is everywhere in his fiction, but probably its most vivid and celebrated expression comes in the section of the trial known as Before the Law. In this episode, a priest tells Joseph K., the man wanted for an unknown crime, an ancient story about a man who seeks admittance to the law. But the door to the law is guarded by a doorkeeper who refuses to let him in. The man spends his entire life waiting for the door to be opened, but it never is. And finally, when he's dying, he asks the doorkeeper why in all that time he has never seen another person ask to be allowed in. No one but you could gain admittance through this door, since this door was intended only for you, the doorkeeper replies. I am now going to shut it. In this story, Kafka never explains exactly what the law is or what it might mean to gain admittance to it. But it's unmistakable that the law, literally the Torah, is the center of Judaism, the thing that pious Jews had studied for generations. And Kafka's pilgrim, unable to find his way into the law, resembles the modern Jew who has no point of entry into Jewish tradition. The Jewish resonance of this parable is made almost explicit in the following pages, when Joseph K. engages the priest in a long and fruitless conversation trying to interpret the story and figure out what it's trying to say. The scriptures are unalterable, the priest remarks, and the comments on them often enough merely express the commentator's bewilderment. This is a scene of failed interpretation, of a scripture that refuses to give up its secrets. Yet by engaging in the process of dialectic, asking questions and ruling out alternatives, Joseph K. seems to be enacting, in a failed and parodic form, the kind of argument that fuels scriptural analysis in the Talmud. In traditional Jewish interpretation, Walter Benjamin pointed out in his essay on Kafka, the story, quote, lies down at the feet of doctrine. The interpreter reads texts in order to make them conform with religious truth, as we saw with Rashi's interpretation of the Reuben story. But in Kafka, Benjamin went on, story, having crouched down, unexpectedly cuffs doctrine with a weighty paw. This resistance to or refusal of interpretation is what makes all of Kafka's work read like a parable with a missing key, an allegory of something that no one can quite name. And this situation, which is Jewish in its origin and its conception, proved to be so universal in experience in the 20th century that Kafka's name was turned into an adjective in order to name it. As always, the local dimension of literature proves not to be an enemy of the universal, but the surest way of reaching the universal. Now, does this mean that the only authentic Jewish literature today is literature about the failure of Jewish tradition? That would be too absolute and pessimistic a conclusion. Rather, the case of Kafka suggests that what makes literature Jewish is its decision to engage with Jewish texts, traditions, and vocabularies, even in a negative way. Doing this does not require an extensive knowledge of Jewish tradition, which neither Benjamin nor Kafka possessed, but it does require an instinct for finding the elements in that tradition which can be used, or even misused, in order to communicate a modern truth. The writer and critic Leon Wieseltier captured this relationship to tradition in a beautiful metaphor. Tradition is not reproduced, it is thrown and caught. It lives a long time in the air. Jewish literature, perhaps, is what happens every time a writer reaches out to make that catch. Thank you. Thanks very much. So I would be happy to take questions if you have any about what I've said or related subjects. In the back?
Hi. I was wondering about if certain ideas about language can exist in the context of Judaism. So the idea that language is a sort of construct or arbitrary in some way, the idea that there are experiences that are beyond the reach of language, or the idea that, for instance, something in Russian can express something that can't be expressed in Hebrew.
Right.
And can any or all of these concepts exist in the context of Jewish literature?
Well, I suppose talking specifically about Benjamin and the idea of translation that he's talking about, he would say just the reverse. He would say language isn't arbitrary. In fact, in his essay called On Language as Such and the Language of Man, he says there's a bourgeois view. Of course, bourgeois means it's wrong. That language is arbitrary, and that's the scientific view, the view we all hold, that it's a sign with a referent, and the sign could be anything. Benjamin says no. In fact, each language is a partial expression of an idea in the mind of God. And that in order to understand the totality of God's mind, you would have to be able to translate something into every possible language, which is a very odd idea when you think about it, but if you think about it in terms of translating the Bible, for example, it maybe comes into focus more, that there's an element of God's word that appears in each language that you wouldn't know if you couldn't translate it. And then in terms of Jewish tradition, going back a little bit, if you look at Jewish mysticism, the idea that God created the universe using the Hebrew alphabet is at the core of Kabbalism and Jewish mysticism. So from that point of view, language would be prior to creation, not something that is just sort of arbitrarily made up. Yes?
I think it's called The Judgment by Kafka. Is that his version of the story of Isaac being sacrificed?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Because the way it ends with the father telling the son,
oh, yes.
Go jump into the river.
Right, right. Where he says, go jump into the river. It is a little bit like, it does definitely evoke the story of Isaac, and it also evokes Freud, right, and the idea of the Oedipus complex, which was being given birth to right at the time that Kafka was writing that story. So it's the decision as to whether you see it as an allusion to the biblical story might be more on the reader's part, right? Than it might be if you choose to read it in a Jewish context, you would bring up that connection.
And the housekeeper says something at the very end. It's been a few years since I've read it.
Yeah.
But it was very puzzling to me when I read the story.
Yeah. That's one of his, I think that might even be his first story, the first piece of fiction he wrote. And it is this sort of fantastical black comedy where he's trying to rebel against the father, and then the father just says, go jump in the river, and he goes and does it. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about this idea that given that some people see textual study as the core of Judaism, and this the idea that follows that intellectuality itself is sort of enough of a criteria to make one Jewish, but that Lionel Trilling, for instance, rejects that. I was wondering how you think, if you have other examples of that not being the case, and if you think that just given sort of the progress of American culture and history in the 20th century, what you think other intellectuals, people similar to Trilling who came after, if they had different conceptions of that, of this dichotomy and this question based on other things that happened historically, and how you think that develops, if at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that with Trilling and his generation, you have a strong desire to, they wouldn't have said assimilate, but to sort of move from the fringes into the center. That they saw being Jewish as a parochial identity, and you would want to get rid of it and be talking, you wouldn't want to be talking about Jewish things, you'd want to be talking about universal human things, which would in practice meant Western and American things. And I think that there's been a shift away from that in subsequent generations. I think that because of the rise of a sort of multicultural ideal, it's much easier to have the sense that your particular identity is not opposed to the universal identity, but is the way that you enter into universal experience. So if you look at the course of American Jewish fiction, for example, the sort of classics of American Jewish fiction are very much about rebelling against, escaping Jewish environment, or sort of being driven crazy by it, like in Portnoy's Complaint. And if you look at the kind of fiction that Jewish writers today are writing, people like Allegra Goodman or Jonathan Rosen or Jonathan Safran Foer, there's a much more affirmative relationship to Jewishness. It's like the need to rebel has died out in a certain way.
So do you think then that those, particularly these contemporary authors, would define themselves more favorably in relation to this idea that textuality is the core of their Jewishness and therefore can be used as an intellectual fact or a Jewish fact or some combination?
I think maybe they would want to go beyond that. They would want to say, just textuality in the way that the Oz's, for example, write about. There's a sort of hopefulness to that idea, but that it's not really enough to say that just being involved with text is a Jewish practice, because it's a human practice. And in order for it to be a Jewish practice, there has to be something Jewish about the texts or about the way that you relate to them. Yeah.
I'm just curious about Jewish textuality and how it might have looked different a long time ago versus today.
Mm.
I'm just thinking about what you said about interpretation of text as like a key feature of being Jewish. And thinking about my own synagogue, where people don't, on the whole, the congregation doesn't, it's a conservative synagogue. On the whole, people don't engage in interpretation themselves, but they'll listen to the rabbi give a sermon about it and
Right.
his interpretation. So I'm curious, is that kind of passive experience, does that count as the same textuality as maybe when people were doing this interpretation themselves?
There has been a really big change in terms of how non-Orthodox Jews, at least, encounter Jewish texts. Talmudic study was always an elite activity. It wasn't something that everyone got to do. It was something you got to do if you were the best student, basically, and if you were lucky and your parents could afford it, then you would move from sort of learning Hebrew and Bible to learning Talmud, which was the more advanced level. So in a sense, to be a Talmudic scholar was already to be an elite intellectual in a pre-modern Jewish context. But I think it's true that there was at least an idea that everyone should be reading the text themselves, which we don't really have anymore. Now it's much more of a model where the rabbi explains the text to you in the form of a sermon. And it's because the average congregant, and I include myself in this, doesn't have the language skills to read those texts. I mean, historically, if you were getting a Jewish education, you didn't speak Hebrew at home. You spoke Yiddish if you're talking about Eastern Europe. But starting from the age of 3, you would learn Hebrew. And then eventually you would learn Aramaic so you could read the Talmud. And Jewish education today doesn't have the component at all, unless you're talking about very traditional, pious communities. So without the language skills, it's basically impossible to have access to that tradition because most of it is not in English, most of it is in Hebrew. And so we're cut off from it in that way. Not that people in Israel, where they do speak Hebrew, are necessarily studying the Talmud on a vast scale either, but at least that particular obstacle isn't there. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about visibility and invisibility, and what I mean by that is I don't want to move away from literature. I teach literature myself, so I'm very excited to continue to talk about that. But I was thinking about debates in the 1980s about the ghettoization of various minority representation in universities. So there was the fear that if you created a Jewish studies program or a gay studies program or an African American studies program, that folks would only study those authors or that culture, that literature within that small minoritized department or program, versus studying Toni Morrison in a course on American literature broadly, or Oscar Wilde, not in a gay course, but in a course in British literature in English. So, to use a pop culture reference, there was lots of debate too in the 90s about the show Seinfeld, that a lot of the creators of Seinfeld were saying that it was not a Jewish show, that it was not about New York Jewish culture, there was a desire to be universal. And that was practical in some way in terms of making audiences feel comfortable. But then there was a lot of discussion also on the internet and the press about the fact that this made a certain kind of celebration of Jewish New York culture invisible to a lot of viewers who had no idea that what they might be watching might be a celebration of such culture. So my question is about visibility and invisibility. This move towards the universal, does one risk not standing up and being counted as a Jewish author or another identity figure? Yeah.
Seinfeld's case, I think, is a good example because there's so much of American culture comes from out of American Jewish experience, and it goes all the way back to Tin Pan Alley and Broadway. And the idea that you would want to claim that as a Jewish achievement, but not want to limit it to a Jewish audience. Philip Roth, for example, there was a documentary about him on PBS earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, an American Master's program. And one of the very first things that you hear him saying in the program is, "I'm not a Jewish writer, I'm an American writer." Now, if Philip Roth says that, you know that there's something going on because there's no more Jewish writer than Philip Roth. Virtually every one of his books is about being Jewish in some way. And I think that there still persists, especially maybe among that generation, the sense that being American is something bigger than being Jewish, which in a numerical sense it obviously is. But in a historical sense it's not. That Judaism goes back way before American Judaism. And that's one way in which Jewish studies, I think, maybe doesn't fit the model of ethnic studies. Because if you're studying Judaism, you're be continuous with an intellectual tradition that goes back thousands of years before America. So you're not studying only Jewish American culture. You're studying a Jewish culture that has so many different manifestations, different languages, and different phases. Yeah.
Yeah, you made the point in your talk that there was a difference between literary criticism in general and Jewish literary criticism in the sense that in Jewish literary criticism, certainly as applied to the Talmud, speaking as someone who studied in the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai, of all places for that matter, that the text, the ultimate text is reverential and cannot be disputed, that the criticism exists within that. I see the similarity between literary criticism and Talmudic criticism as being very, very similar in the sense that you have a very detailed, fine-grained analysis of the text.
Yeah.
What interests me is having studied the Talmud, there was absolutely no emphasis on writing.
Yeah.
The emphasis was entirely 6 days a week, no secular program whatsoever, on studying the Talmud.
Yeah.
Where did the impulse to produce literature rather than criticism originate? How far back is that? I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on where you start or what you're looking at. If you're talking about, I mean, one reason I talked about Solomon Maimon is that he is a figure who dramatizes that transition. For thousands of years, or for 1,500 years, the best Jewish minds, you could say, were happy to operate within a Talmudic horizon. So if you had someone like Maimonides, the greatest genius ever produced by Judaism, one way that he applied his genius was by systematizing the Talmud. That, for him, was a good use of his mind. Whereas with Solomon Maimon growing up in Lithuania in the 1750s, for some reason, that wasn't enough. And he started to think about everything that he wasn't getting in his curriculum instead of the things that he was getting. If you study the Talmud, which I do a little bit in a sort of amateur way, one of the interesting things about it to me that I've discovered is that you can't really do it without ending up studying a lot of other things. So you have to study mathematics and geometry and some astronomy, and there's all kinds of different subjects that you end up studying if you're studying the Talmud in a really in-depth way. But at a certain point, you had not just in Jewish culture, but in Christian culture, the emergence of this secular enlightened sphere. And for the first time, it became possible to say, I'm not leaving Judaism for Christianity. I'm leaving it for universalism or for secular humanism. And that means that it's no longer apostasy to leave Judaism. It's something else. It's some kind of progress. And that's what I think the difference is, that once you no longer feel that you're contributing to this ancient process of elaborating religious truths, but you want some sort of direct personal expression, then you have to be writing creative literature rather than commentary and criticism. Yeah.
It occurs to me that in your interpretation of Kafka's parable Before the Law, and seeing it as in some ways paradigmatic for a certain kind of Jewish literature, Jewish interpretation, that its spread and its power was very much connected to an idea of modernity. And I'm curious that if this notion of Jewishness and Jewish literature is connected to the fate of modernism or some idea of modernity, and to the extent that modernism or modernity is challenged or itself fractured, that also challenges the kind of Jewishness that we described.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, you could say that kind of Jewishness is a product of a very particular Central European historical moment that we don't inhabit anymore. So if being Jewish means that you are educated in German, Kafka has a famous thing about this, about how you can't write German, you can't write anything else, and you can't not write. So you're sort of trapped. If being Jewish means that you're educated in German culture, and yet Germans don't accept you as part of that culture, then your paradigmatic Jewish experience is persecution and exclusion, just like in the trial, that everyone is thinking that you've done something, you don't know what it is, you can't figure out what the mark is on you, but everyone else can see it. And that becomes a paradigmatic modern experience, that Jews become, and not just Kafka, but in all kinds of domains, the Jewish experience becomes representative in a similar way to the gay experience. You could talk about Proust in that context also. Proust, in his novel, in the Sodom and Gomorrah section, has a whole extended metaphor in which he says Jews in European society are like gays in that they're members of a secret group within society who recognize each other but can't be recognized by people outside the group. Now, today, we live in a very different, especially in America, we live in a totally different environment. And we have Israel, which has also totally transformed the way Jewishness is lived. So you could say that that particular conjunction is over, and being Jewish is not the key or a key to modern identity in the way that it used to be, which could be liberating in a way. Yes?
Yeah, I was reading a biography of Miles Davis, and he was talking about how jazz came from a lot of different places. It was a white thing, it was a black thing, and white people got it. It came from different elements. But bebop, he said, no, that was a black thing. And I'm just wondering if you had any ideas what might be Jewish bebop, something that if you don't have a Jewish way of looking at things, a Jewish sensibility, it might just be impenetrable to...
Well, the thing that would immediately spring to mind is comedy, right? That there's a sort of Jewish comic sensibility that feels very Jewish. But at the same time, who's more popular in America than Jewish comedians? So it's obviously not something that you have to be Jewish to hear or to understand, but there is some connection. I mean, it's one of those fields, one of the many fields in which the Jewish contribution is so disproportionate that you feel like there's something going on, there's some sort of connection there. And it has to do with how you react to persecution, to danger, to disempowerment, and that the evolution of that sensibility, once freed from all those things, then becomes this great gift, that you're no longer using it just to survive or to thwart attacks. You are able to use it to create comedy that everyone loves. So I don't know if there's anything, and the same is true of bebop, obviously. I mean, obviously everyone can listen to it, everyone can enjoy it. So it's a good analogy. I mean, in what sense is jazz black music if you don't have to be black to make it or to enjoy it, and yet many of the people who invented it were? What is the differential? It's one of those ambiguities that I don't know if you can get to the bottom of. Yeah.
Just to go back to that, I would say Hasidic chanting would be very similar to bebop. In this
Oh,
way.
yeah?
That's very genuinely Jewish. And I haven't seen it in any other culture, in any other kind of music.
Yeah.
And much of it, of course, is wordless. It's just chants.
Right, just the melodies.
It can go on for quite a long time.
Yeah. Yes.
Isn't it true that because so many comedians have been Jewish, that actually Yiddish humor has subverted the American sense of humor, and in fact, American humor is Yiddish humor?
I think to a certain extent that's definitely true, but it wouldn't be the whole story, because there's also black humor, and there's Italian humor, and there's Irish humor. I mean, a lot of the kinds of jokes that you find in Jewish comedy, you can also find in the comedy of other minorities who have been persecuted because they have a similar reaction.
Seinfeld, that's Shmuel and Shmazel humor, which is a tradition in Yiddish literature and humor.
Yeah. Well, Seinfeld is a good example, because if you're Jewish and you watch that show, you think, come on, these are obviously, I mean, this is so obviously a New York Jewish phenomenon. Everything in it, the black and white cookies and the marble rye and the way the parents interact with the children. And yet, however many people, 50 million people, watched that show and loved it. So again, I think that what the lesson is that you begin in the particular to reach the universal, and that people can respond to different particularity than their own and can take it on. Yeah.
This kind of leads to a question which I was thinking of throughout, which is there something that's really a Jewish literature that's not written by Jews?
Yeah.
And you see this question in new interpretations of traditional Chinese literature, a lot of which was actually written by people in classical Chinese, but in Japan and in Korea. And there's an ongoing debate. And of course, it's engaging with Chinese texts. It's written in Chinese. People who are writing are not ethnically Chinese, and that's coming into part of the discussion of Chinese literature now, and I'm wondering what sorts of discussions are going on. Is there a Jewish literature not written by Jews?
That I haven't heard about much discussion of that in an American context, because you would say that it's all a subset of American literature. So you can borrow techniques from American Jewish literature to write about other kinds of experiences. In exactly the same way that Call It Sleep by Henry Roth, which is one of the sort of classic novels about Jewish immigrant upbringing on the Lower East Side, is written in the style of Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So there's nothing, the style can be used to explore, to talk about all different kinds of experience. The place where I think it would be really interesting to look at that would be Israeli literature, and literature in Hebrew by non-Jewish Israelis, of which does exist, although I don't know much about it, and that would be a very interesting phenomenon, that you're writing in Hebrew, a Jewish language, but about a non-Jewish experience.
I want to thank Adam Kirsch for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you all.